So I've never been the one to really enjoy watching news. I know that sounds surprising given that I'm running a geopolitical news YouTube channel. But I really only started watching news or getting involved with current affairs when the Ukraine war started. And well, that's not quite correct, because it would have started perhaps a few years before. But the thing is, I didn't really become involved because of watching news. What got my interest in the Ukraine war was because I was trying to get wealthy. So stick with me here for a bit. I read countless personal finance books. Most of them, tell you the generic stuff. Save 10% of your income. Live below your means. Until I came across a story in one of Robert Greene's books. If you don't know who Robert Greene is, you should look him up. He has, I would say, 4 seminal books: 48 Laws of Power, 33 Strategies of War, Art of Seduction, Mastery, which is perhaps one of my favorite. I read this book years ago, and there was one story that struck out to me. And I read it so long ago, I can't even remember the details, who was the story about. But one lesson really remained with me from reading that story. And it was about a man who became either wealthy or rose to power because he was able to tune in to the signs of the times, the signs of major shifts in the world, and he was able to ride the right wave to power and wealth. And that really struck out to me, and I was like, this is some practical advice. So I did everything that the personal finance book says, but I also said I need to be more attuned to what's going on geopolitically.
Really smart.
To see what shifts are taking place. But I didn't go to the news. I went to YouTube. And I started listening to a lot of channels and speakers who were talking about the US dollar declining, the overprinting of money, US enemies being China and Russia and Iran and the axis of evil. So I decided to see what they're doing. And I remember it was either an article that a video pointed me to, or the video itself spoke about Russia and China, but more so Russia was buying up lots of gold. I thought, well, that's interesting. And I read personal finance books that talk about in these times when paper currency is heading down, a good hedge is buying gold or hard assets. So I was like, why would they be doing this? But even then, my interest was cursory. So in comes the war in Ukraine.
It was unprovoked, but this is what Russian President Vladimir Putin unleashed on Ukraine.
And I decided to give news a chance and watched a bit of mainstream media. And I was like, this stuff has to be geared for 19, 20-year-olds who believe in Hollywood fanfare movies. I remember seeing images of Ukrainian models, beautiful women, with an AK-47 in their hand. And the story was, they're getting ready to fight Russia. I remember they spoke about civilians, some of them very old, making Molotov cocktails to counter the Russians when they came Kiev. All in an attempt to show this image that Russia is evil and the people of Ukraine want to be removed from Putin's influence, so much so that old women and young women were willing to fight. And I thought, this is a lot of BS. And this is before I knew any details about the Ukraine-Russia war. I just thought, there's no way you're telling me that Molotov cocktails and models with AK-47s is going to do anything to stop the Russian army. First of all the images looked so fake that Russian female models would throw away their careers to go to war. I mean, it just seemed very bogus. But that's all you got on Western mainstream media. So that, being an attorney at law, aroused my legal suspicion. And I decided to go in another direction and to find the truth, or at least to get the other side of the story. And that became my journey into YouTube, and I found all these interesting channels that were telling The other side, and here's the thing, the other side always seemed far more realistic than what you got on mainstream media. And the other side tended to be far more pro-Russian. When I listened to Scott Ritter, Colonel Douglas McGregor, and later on Colonel Daniel Davies, Professor Richard Wolff, all these authorities were saying, realistically, Ukraine doesn't have a chance. Russia versus Ukraine is like America versus Mexico. It doesn't matter if Russia and China were to send Mexico all the weapons they can. Fighting that war on America's backyard on the border with Mexico, America will always become victorious. Then I came across an article in 2016 in The Atlantic, very pro-West, and they were interviewing President Obama. And the reporter was sort of niggling him about being too soft on Putin and Russia. And I remember Obama said, listen, we can't defeat Russia in its backyard in Ukraine. And he said these words, Russia will always have escalatory dominance in Ukraine. And I thought that was an interesting way to put it. It suggested that Russia would always be dominant and win, but he chose the words escalatory dominance. That piqued my curiosity because Obama is a smart man, whether or not you agree with his policies. So I decided to find out what did that mean. And then I came across Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. And then I came across an article pro-Western that said Putin's invasion was pursuant to Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. And on February 24th, when he launched the invasion, he sent an emissary to the United Nations with the requisite form they had to fill out. And attached to that form his February 24th speech. So then I realized his speech was really written for the United Nations to justify his special military operation. So then I realized I had to read both Article 51 to understand what it said and how it framed the operation, as well as you had to read the February 24th speech. And when you read those two, it makes everything clear as to why Putin has fought this war the way he has, in such a limited, restrained fashion. And therefore, all the narrative in the news that this was supposed to end in 3 days, that this was a full-scale invasion by Russia, that Russia plans to take over the Soviet Union, all of that falls by the wayside when you read those two documents. So what do the documents say? Well, first of all, Putin's speech. It's very long. I'm not going to recite everything. I can't even remember everything, but the main things are what were the purposes or what were the goals of the special military operation. And we have demilitarization, denazification, preservation of the people or protection of the people in the Donbass, i.e. Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast, keeping Ukraine out of NATO. But what he also stated in his speech, which is often overlooked, is that I do not intend to occupy territory. We don't want to impose anything on others against their will. So that frames the special military operation. It's a small force sent in to destroy the army, destroy its defense industry, keep it out of NATO, and thereby protect the Donbass people. It was not an occupation army. Territorial ambitions were never the goal, and therefore there is no evidence that Putin came to revive the Soviet Empire and take territory beyond Ukraine or even take the entirety of Ukraine. And he didn't bring the force to do it. Let me give you an example. When Germany invaded Poland in World War II, they brought something like 1.5 million troops. That's an occupation army to take an entire country of Poland, which is smaller than Ukraine. You're telling me Putin came into Ukraine with less than 20% of that number, 190,000 troops, to take under control of a country that's larger than Poland, with less troops than Germany did? And that's what the mainstream media news was telling you. It doesn't make sense. So what does Article 51 say? Well, here's where it gets interesting. Article 51 is the right to self-defense of a country. I believe it was used by the US in the invasion in Iraq. But the US got their jurists to interpret it as really meaning preemptive self-defense. And although it sounds very, let's say, convenient, that interpretation. It makes sense. The rationale being that you cannot wait for another nation to attack you to trigger self-defense, because that first strike could be devastating. Therefore, you should be able to launch a preemptive strike when you see, and when, if called to the UN courts, you can prove that there was an imminent threat. Second limb is the most relevant and most important to note about this special military operation. The second limb says your response must be proportionate. And that is what has constrained Putin. Let me give you an example. In self-defense and law, if a man comes at you with his fists in a threatening manner, you are allowed to defend yourself. But if you take out a gun to shoot him, it's not proportionate to the threat. However, if during his threat he picks up a knife, you are allowed to pick up a bigger knife to defend yourself. And therefore, as he escalates, you can also escalate. And I bring you back to the words of President Obama: escalatory dominance. This is a war about incremental escalation. Notice, it was only after Ukraine hit the Kerch Bridge, civilian infrastructure from the mainland to Crimea, that Russia decided to launch the first and largest missile campaign hitting Ukraine's energy infrastructure. It waited till Ukraine escalated first. It was only after Ukraine did the counteroffensive to Kharkiv that Russia mobilized an additional 300,000 reserves. When many said he should have done that before, he should have done it since the day that Boris Johnson flew into Ukraine on April 9th and told Ukraine, throw away that peace agreement in Istanbul. We will back you with the weapons to fight Russia to the end. After Ukraine had already done a general mobilization, everybody would say that's when Putin should have done his mobilization, because then it became clear that he was fighting NATO in Ukraine. But he waited for months. He waited until there was evidence of escalation, in my opinion, so that he can justify a special military operation in line with international law. So, Obama knew it. He knew the law, because he's a lawyer. And he knew that Russia will always have escalatory dominance in Ukraine. So what else has Western media told us that makes me completely averse to so-called news from them? Because it's not news, it's a narrative. Most of it is propaganda. You get a few articles here and there that tell the truth in the West, but here's how you tell the difference. When you read articles that are very pro-West and pro-Ukraine, read it carefully with a fine-tooth comb and look to see what the sources are cited. And here's what you usually see. Unnamed, anonymous US officials making statements. Ukrainian officials as their source, or broad vague terms like experts say or widely believed. And that's not actually proper journalism. Journalists are supposed to name their source, and they usually should have the source corroborated before they publish it. That doesn't exist in this war, especially in the West. Sometimes they don't even put a source. They are just writing paragraphs based on the journalist's opinion. That's how you know it's propaganda. When you read articles that say things negative about Ukraine, the source is usually Ukrainian soldiers on the ground itself. Which brings me to the second reason why there's no news in the West. President Zelensky has initiated a media blackout on the front lines, such that no media is allowed to come to the front lines to film what is going on. This didn't occur in the first two world wars, where there's footage of the front line. You have to go to YouTube, the Telegram, the independent journalists to get the footage. Well, why? Because he doesn't want his Western backers and the Western population to see the very one-sided nature of this war, that Russia is destroying Ukraine at a rate of probably 10 to 1 in terms of attrition, of casualties, and equipment losses. Here's another lie they told. It was an unprovoked invasion. That Putin just woke up on February of 2022 and decided to go on a genocidal rampage to restore the Soviet Union. But now the Western officials, they are even contradicting that narrative when Jens Stoltenberg admitted that this war started in 2014.
didn't start in February last year. The war started in 2014, and since 2014, NATO allies have provided support to Ukraine with training, with equipment, so the Ukrainian armed forces were much stronger in 2022 than they were in 2014, and of course that made a huge difference when President Putin decided to attack Ukraine.
Here's another lie the so-called news said, that this war was not about NATO expansion, that it was about Putin's campaign for territorial conquest. Again, the Secretary General of NATO walked back that statement when he said that this war is about NATO expansion. Take a listen to this clip.
President Putin declared in the autumn of 2021, and he actually sent a draft treaty that he wanted NATO to sign to promise no more NATO enlargement. That was what he sent us. And that was a precondition for not invade Ukraine. Of course, we didn't sign that. The opposite happened. He wanted us to sign a promise never to enlarge NATO. He wanted us to remove our military infrastructure in all allies that have joined NATO since 1997, meaning half of NATO, all the Central and Eastern Europe. We should remove NATO from that part of our alliance, introducing some kind of E and B or second-class membership. We rejected that. So he went to war to prevent more NATO close to is borders.
Then there's the ghost of Kiev. And then we come to the fall offensives of 2022, when there was an absolute blitzkrieg in the information space, where Western media would have you believing that Ukraine was on the cusp of victory because they took a buffer zone in Kharkiv, which, by the way, had no military significance except for PR, and the buffer zone in Kherson, which the only reason why they did that counteroffensive there is because it needed to remove that bridgehead before they launched the real counteroffensive through Zaporizhia. So this summer 2023 counteroffensive was really the only true counteroffensive and the only true chance Ukraine had at victory. And it failed miserably. That blitzkrieg army, NATO-trained army, NATO put its signature on it. They said they didn't want any experienced Ukrainian soldiers who were steeped in Soviet Union training. They wanted men fresh off the street to give them advanced NATO training. They gave them some of their best tanks, the Leopard 2A6s. And that army was destroyed before it reached the first defensive line. A total embarrassment. How could it go so badly? Maybe because you believed your own hype. Maybe because Ukraine really thought they could win because of all the news they were getting of imminent victory. So I'm not going to go into much more detail, but the point of this is to say there is no news in the West, especially when it comes to foreign policy. There's only narratives, there's only propaganda.